Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shri Zaheer, Dean of the Carlson School of Management. And today we were supposed to have our first blended in-person and live-streamed First Tuesday, but we've had to quickly pivot to our virtual format based on new guidance around COVID-19 safety. And especially to those of you who anticipated attending in person and were eager to do so, thank you so much for your flexibility, your patience, your understanding. These are indeed strange times. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining us again for First Tuesday. First Tuesday, as many of you know, is the longest running business gathering in Minnesota. And the pandemic certainly hasn't paused our momentum even one bit. And while the past year and a half pushed us online, it also greatly expanded this gathering to include the Carlson School's entire global community. And we've been so happy to be able to share our speakers with a broader worldwide audience. So this is our first gathering for the 2021-2022 academic year. And we have another wonderful series of speakers who will be sharing their insights on leadership in the coming months. But before we move to our program, I'd like to recognize a few people. Thank you especially to Regent Farnsworth and Regent Johnson for joining us today online. And thank you as well to our long-standing corporate and media sponsors who've continued their support, even as we gathered virtually for the last year and a half. That's Wells Fargo and Twin Cities Business. Today, we are joined by our featured speaker, Bill Lentsch, for a fireside chat. This past June, Bill just retired from his position as Chief Customer Experience Officer at Delta, where he oversaw everything from in-flight service to operations and customer care to IT innovation. As a long-time frequent flyer with Delta, it's been over 30 years when we started with Northwest. I have to say I've been most impressed by how well they have handled so many things during this time. And of course, while operations for every industry were challenged by the pandemic, Bill certainly oversaw one of the most disruptive periods in airline history. And prior to this role, Bill served in various roles in the airline industry, including being Executive Vice President for Flying and Air Operations with Delta, Senior Vice President for Delta Connection and Global Services, CEO for Delta's regional carrier Endeavor Air, and prior to that, 20 years with Northwest Airlines before their merger with Delta. So this coming October, I'm delighted to announce that he will begin a new role as the Chief Operating Officer of the Catholic Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis. A Minnesota native, Bill is a gopher. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota in aerospace engineering and mechanics, while also balancing being on the Gopher baseball team. And later, he received his MBA from the University of St. Thomas. So everyone, please welcome Bill Lentsch.
Thank you, Sri. It's good to be here with you and good to be with all of you as well. Like Sri, I wish this could have been in person. I was looking forward to that, and hopefully sometime soon we can get back to that mode and we can do it on a permanent basis. But it's really good to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, you've had a really interesting career with so many leadership positions in the airline industry. Could you just walk us through your aviation and your leadership background?
Sure. So before I get into that, though, I'm quickly going to give you the background on my family, because what you'll learn about me is family comes first. I grew up in the Twin Cities, as did my wife, married, 4 kids, 2 of them married, 2 grandchildren, and a dog. So they are the center of my life. While I haven't always been able to keep that focus through some of these difficult times, I have to keep pushing myself back to what's most important to me, and that is my family. So I grew up in the Twin Cities, went to the University of Minnesota. First job out of college, I was a wing design engineer at General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Texas. So I learned how to build airplanes. I wanted to fly them, Didn't go down that path, so I thought if I couldn't do that, I'm going to learn how to build them. And spent a couple of years in Fort Worth, Texas at General Dynamics, and then made my way to Northwest in 1989. And through my 32-year career between Northwest and Delta, had several different types of roles, and this will be meaningful when we talk a little bit later. But started in engineering, worked in line maintenance, worked in materials management, spent time in finance after I received my MBA, worked in hangar maintenance, business unit manager, did a lot of budgeting work. I've spent time working in airports, running operations centers. So I've had a really good view of the airline industry through various perspectives. One which I would say the very multifaceted perspective, I would say was most helpful and I would say crucial as we went through this last year and a half at Delta and navigated the pandemic. So various levels, different operating groups, primarily focused on operations in my leadership roles, but I've had a couple of roles outside of operations as well. The airline has been really good about this, and that is developing leaders who have an opportunity to work in different roles to build their toolbox so that when they move to the next level, they have the full set of tools to understand the enterprise impact of their decisions, rather than just staying focused in one particular area. I've been very pleased about the way both Northwest and Delta have developed leaders that way.
Thanks, Bill. I mean, what an amazing career that you've seen so many aspects of the airline industry as you sort of rose through the ranks. This is amazing. And so I'm sure, all this experience that you've accumulated has helped you with what you had to do in the past, as 18 months ago and since. As you know, the past 18 months has been some of the most challenging, I'm sure, in the history of aviation. Certainly has been the most challenging in the history of higher education. So tell us a little bit about the early days of COVID and how did you and the Delta team sort of form your strategy to take on what needed to be done to combat this virus?
Sure, and I in no way want to diminish how impactful this last year and a half has been on everybody. We've all been impacted different ways, but it has been significant. The airline industry, and I would say maybe the cruise industry, possibly the most dramatically impacted, because what we saw, if you dial the clock back to March of 2020, what we saw was our revenue decline by 95% in a week, because we, along with the cruise industry and maybe a few other types of transportation, we put people close together when we execute on our product. People were very uncomfortable. Travelers were very uncomfortable getting on board airplanes, going through airports, getting on board airplanes, getting on trains, buses, getting onto cruise ships. And so we had to respond very quickly. The airline industry is tremendously dynamic. It was particularly dynamic over the last year and a half. What do you do when you have a 90,000 employee business and you see revenue go from what it was pre-pandemic down 95% in a matter of a week? And I recall the meeting we had, the first meeting with my leader at the time, Ed Bastian. He came into the room with all the senior leaders and he laid out a very clear, a very concise framework upon which we were going to operate. There were 3 pillars to that. Protect our people. That meant both our employees and our customers. That was number 1, intentionally number 1. Need to protect our people. Number 2, preserve our cash. We knew cash was going to bleed very quickly and we had to find a way to reduce the cash burn. And then 3, preserve or protect our future. We weren't going to mortgage the future just to get through the next 6, 12, 18 months. And so Ed laid that out. I give him all the credit for this. He was very clear. He was very concise. He was very committed to those 3 pillars of the way we were going to operate going forward. So under that framework, we went to work very quickly. What can we do to protect our people? what could we do? Testing wasn't available at the time. We were just learning about this pandemic. In fact, didn't really even know we were in a pandemic. We just knew that we were in real distress as a business. So what could we do to protect our people? We partnered with the Mayo Clinic. We partnered with CVS, with Emory Health. We partnered with other travel-related industries like Disney. We partnered with hotel groups just to learn as much as we could. We weren't the experts on health. We weren't the experts on how to respond to something like this. So we had to develop the partnerships and call them in. And those were leveraged throughout the entire 18 months to help us produce a result that we were very satisfied with. We know our customers were very satisfied with. Communication, we had to stay in touch on a very regular basis. While our general offices closed in Atlanta, we still had leadership there every week meeting. We had daily meetings that we didn't have prior to the pandemic, where we would get together and we would strategize. And candidly, Sri, what we thought was right one week was not right the next week. And this is what the Mayo Clinic guided us on at the very beginning of our relationship. They said, look, if you think you understand where you are going this week, just know it's going to change next week. We didn't have a clear understanding of what we were responding to, but we had to keep in our mind, protect our people, preserve our cash, don't mortgage the future, preserve the future, protect the future. And so regular meetings to strategize as a team at the most senior level, and then each of those leaders would break out and have their daily strategy sessions with their own groups. Stay in close contact with the customer. We had to make sure the customer understood what it was that we were doing to protect them, where we were going to continue to operate, where their concerns were, and we would have to respond to those. Heck, my team was getting together every morning at 7:30. And you can imagine, the first week of March, we're flying full airplanes and we're providing full catering service. Nobody's wearing masks. Everyone is, in close proximity in the airport and on board the airplane. That wasn't okay a couple of weeks after that. And we had to figure out how to redesign the product. How do you decontent catering? How do you spread people out on board the airplane? What do you do to make sure that they're spread as they're boarding the airplane? How do you keep the air clean? These are all things that we were learning along the way. And so that daily, we call it the war room meeting that we had every morning, was discussing what it was that the customer was telling us. What are we hearing from the experts? Let's bring the science in as well. What does that mean we have to do to our product and our service? Okay, let's make the decisions. Let's go. We would go that day, and the next day we would come back and we would understand how's the implementation going? What are we hearing from our employees? What are we hearing from the customer? And do we need to make adjustments? We had daily adjustments going for months and months and months until we finally settled into what we wanted to do in a pared down version of our product or our service to make sure everyone was well protected, but we could minimize the cash burn, but we could continue to push forward into the future. It required daily responsiveness, and I would call it agility. And for a company the size of Delta, to make that happen, it's not real easy, but it's made easier by regular forms of communication. We opened up what we're doing right here. We started weekly conversations with our frontline employees over our version of Facebook. We call it Sky Hub. We had regular memos coming out from Ed all the way down to frontline leaders. We had various email communications that were going out, video communication that was going out. We opened up all the lines of communication and were fully transparent about what it was that we were doing, so our people knew where we were going. It was just a day-to-day, we called it hand-to-hand combat for months on end.
Amazing. I mean, there's no playbook for this at all. I mean, this is just it was, learn as you go along. I mean, this is just quite amazing. But your lessons about communicate, putting people first, preserving your cash and, protecting the future. I mean, and, you told us, a bit about how you, protected your people. What did it mean in terms of preserving cash?
Yeah. So before I go there, one thing that I'll just kind of overarching all this, Sri, is that we have this motto: people before profits, which in a period of time where you're burning cash like we were at the front end, we were burning $100 million of cash a day in March of 2020. And we had a goal to get that daily cash burn down to zero at some point in the not too distant, and it took months, but we were able to ultimately maneuver to that point. Some of it was we had 40,000 of our employees at any given time for a couple of months who were taking voluntary unpaid leaves. We didn't need them in the operation. They understood that we were in survival mode. And so they would raise their hand anywhere from a 1 month leave. Some have took a full year leave. Maybe good for them personally, but for many of them, it was a sacrifice to help preserve the jobs and help ensure the future of Delta. So there were unpaid leaves. We offered an early out package to some employees, and many of them took advantage of that. There were 15, 17,000, somewhere in that range, who took advantage of an early out package. We had to decontent some of the service for a temporary period of time. We did some renegotiating on some of our deals that we had with our suppliers. They were in the same situation we were in, but they understood the importance of the partnership, and they worked very closely with us to help restructure some of our commitments so that they could manage through it, we could manage through it, and we would both be stronger in the future as a result of it. So we took a multi-pronged approach to figuring out what we could do, and nothing was off the table. Everything was on the table. There were no sacred cows. We talked through it all. And in the end, through these daily conversations we had, we came up with the appropriate combination of cost reduction, as well as continuing to operate the business in a very quality way. In fact, I'll put in a little bit of a Delta commercial here. It was the first time, last year was the first time in 26 years that Delta won the J.D. Power Award for the customer satisfaction among airlines. It was an award we were striving to get for years and years and years. And last year, because of all the actions we took, we achieved the award. So we didn't give up on the brand. We found the right cost to take out at the time. And now Delta's in a mode of rebuilding back its operational scope and scale.
Right. No, I mean, it's obviously, everyone has contributed to, all the employees, and, I know the customers were happy with what was provided and the actions that Delta had taken. So clearly, you did something very, very remarkable in terms of getting it all, working together and sort of and being in a position now to, grow the business again. So that's, that's quite amazing. Were there any key learnings along the way? Anything that you, maybe that you thought you may have done differently too?
Sure. Well, and we touched on it a little bit, and you made a comment on this, Sri. One thing that we always believed at Delta, but it was clearly in lights as we went through this pandemic, and that is that culture matters. There is a very deep culture at Delta, which is based on a direct relationship, open, honest, direct relationship with its people. I'd say but I can't anymore now that I'm retired from there. But this very deep relationship, this very strong culture, was what I believe allowed Delta to excel during the pandemic. You made a comment about it. There's no playbook for something like this. There was no playbook. We were changing the procedures, the policies. We were changing the product. We were changing all of this on the fly. And our people, and I give the Delta people all the credit for this, they executed beautifully. flight attendants, when they were interviewing for their role, they didn't know that they were going to be asked to keep an eye on compliance to face masks on board airplanes. But we asked them to do that because there is now a mandate. There wasn't originally, we put one out on our own, Delta did, put out our own mandate for masks on board our airplanes. And if anyone refused to wear a mask, they were not going to be invited to fly with Delta in the future. Well, our flight attendants and our gate agents were responsible for ensuring compliance to that. So nobody boarded an airplane without a mask. And when you were on board an airplane, if you took your mask off, our flight attendants were, in their very kind, gentle way, were going to remind people to put their masks on. But eventually, if they didn't, they ended up on the no-fly list. Last I knew, there were about 1,600 of our customers who went on a no-fly list because they would not comply. But these are the kinds of things that employees did not bargain for when they interviewed for the job, but they stepped up and they executed beautifully. From face mask wearing to all the cleaning that we had to do, to the way we had to restructure the product and the service. I can go across the board, the entire organization, everyone had to respond. So what I learned is culture fueled that. It was not something that we trained to. It was just our people knew what to do. They understood what the customer wanted, what we were hoping for, and our frontline employees could just execute on it. Agility is really important. At a moment of crisis, people remember how you cared for them, but that method of caring is going to change based on whether it's CDC guidance or it is confidence from the consumer or whatever it might be, and having the ability to maneuver along with those guidelines and making sure that we're giving the confidence to the customer that we're doing everything to keep them safe and keep them protected on board the airplane. As far as learnings go, I would say one of the primary learnings, and maybe this is our hindsight certainly is 2020, and maybe something difficult to predict. It's not easy to put an airline to bed. So when you're flying 1,000 airplanes, for example, we put 500-600 airplanes on the ground almost immediately. Putting an airline to bed is not terribly difficult. I mean, it's not easy, but it's not terribly difficult. Growing it back is really hard. And knowing what you need to do well in advance of bringing the operation back to full strength, particularly when the pent-up demand was there, and we knew it was there, but we just didn't know, one, how quickly it would respond, and then two, the difficulty getting your hands on the labor market and getting what you needed, particularly with your suppliers, whether it's the cleaning crews or it is the fuelers or it is the sky caps or whoever it might be who you're purchasing services from. Just being prepared and looking at some worst case scenarios and planning around that. That, as a leader, that's one where I take responsibility that maybe should have looked a little bit further down the field and been prepared for the comeback and making sure that we can respond to the comeback a little bit better. So there's always learnings in these kinds of things, but again, I would say, even if you haven't learned everything that you need to, if you have a strong culture to fall back on, it will cover a lot of sins, and Delta has that.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of culture again, because I was going to ask you this, take you back a little bit, maybe back in time to an earlier phase of your career. You've talked about the culture of Delta a great deal. And, I've done some work on, mergers and acquisitions and the roles of the role culture and identity plays in mergers. And, and Delta was the product of two great airlines. I mean, Northwest Airlines and Delta merged. And, even as a customer, we realized that they did have different cultures. So how did that, could you go back in time a little bit and remember maybe how that process of cultural integration happened, and what did you see as a result?
Sure. So 19 years at Northwest Airlines and then 13 years at Delta Airlines. So I had the perspective of both cultures, good or bad. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but Northwest, more heavily unionized culture. I'm just going to be factual here. Delta, very limited in its union representation. It was essentially the pilots and the meteorologists and the dispatchers at Delta who were unionized, but many of the operating groups at Northwest, and in fact, maybe all of them unionized. I could work in both environment, no issue, but having that direct relationship with employees, I think builds a deeper culture than what we were able to achieve at Northwest. Northwest was incredibly talented, particularly on the team, particularly on the operating side and the financial management side. And so bringing those two qualities into the relationship, along with Delta's focus on the brand, its great people culture, and as well having good operational and financial discipline, pulling all that together. As we were doing that, and at the time of the merger, I was running the Minneapolis airport. So I had the gate agents, I had the ramp agents, tower de-icing functions, had to work with the Metropolitan Airports Commission, with the FAA, with the CBP. So had a lot of different relationships going on. And the one thing that ultimately I believe allowed us to break through and meld the culture in a way that I think very consistent with the way Delta has operated for its entirety. That is really listening, taking action, being committed to your follow through, developing that trust with your people, and then just doing that over and over and over again. So through town hall meetings and other forms of communication, we were listening and we were taking action and making sure that the frontline employee was very much involved in our strategy, decision making, and ultimately helping us with the execution, of course, on what it was that we were changing. So I think a lot of that has to do with just providing an open ear, listening, and then making those employees feel valued and part of the team. I will tell you, I continued to fly. So when I became part of Delta, I started flying to Atlanta every week, and I continued to fly every week up until my retirement. I flew to Atlanta a lot. And the first year or two, when I boarded the airplane, I could tell just by the way I was greeted whether or not that flight attendant crew was a pre-merger Northwest or a pre-merger Delta crew, just by the way they were interacting with me. By year 3 or 4, as they had spent time working together and integrating and innovating together, that went away. And I could not tell any further. So it doesn't happen quickly. It takes time. It takes a firm commitment to the values and to your morals, and then staying consistent with them. And people ultimately will understand what is real about you and whether or not they want to be part of that. And they'll get in line.
So coming to today now, what do you see as the future of travel? What doesn't change as a result of the experience the airlines have had in the past 18 months?
Well, one thing is for certain, I can tell you about Delta anyway, and maybe the other carriers, is, and this might be stating, the captain obvious here, but cleaning is a very important part of the business. In fact, Delta started, when I was at Delta, I had a vice president reporting directly to me who was responsible for nothing other than global cleanliness. And we built an organization that was about 250 to 300 people strong within Delta, and then worked with our suppliers who do the cleaning on the airplane to make sure that the airplanes and our facilities are clean. So I think there's the experience there, and that might seem trivial, but that's very important to our customers and our employees. Our flight attendants, their office is on board the airplane. The galley, the aisles, the lavatory, I mean, that is where they spend their time on board the airplane. So that, I think, is a permanent change, particularly at Delta. But digital experience, being able to self-serve, not have to have as much interaction. I mean, that may have been the path that airlines were going down anyway, but I think that accelerated over the year 2020 is those digital tools, touchless experiences, things that Delta and others are very focused on investing in. So digital technology, self-serve, touchless interaction, I think is going to be a big part of it. Mass personalization is a term that we used quite regularly over the last year, and that is really understanding, getting to know the customer and getting to serve them better through the physical and the digital experience. And so what do you do to get to know your customer better? It's not just surveying. The system on board the airplanes at Delta, the Wi-Fi system, the previous supplier was GoGo. You probably have, those of you who've flown have probably seen the GoGo logo somewhere around. It was not performing to the expectations of the customer, the expectations of Delta. And so we made a commitment through the pandemic. And this is one thing, this is part of the don't mortgage the future. While we were going through the pandemic and we were bleeding millions of dollars a day in cash, we made a decision to invest in a new Wi-Fi product on board the airplane, supplied by Viasat, that will give us a whole lot of flexibility, greater reliability, greater bandwidth, will allow customers to make individual choices about how they want to be served on board the airplane, will allow customers either through their handheld or through that seatback screen in front of them to communicate ultimately with the flight attendant who's holding on to what we call a Sky Pro. So finding a way to individualize the experience, we call it mass personalization, individualize the experience more than maybe what we have had in the past. As far as where airplanes are going to fly, now that we're able to do some remote work, there's a unique phenomena that we're starting to, we were seeing when I left, and I think continues, and that is that those who may be able to live at their cabin in Brainerd, Minnesota, but might have a headquarters somewhere else, can do their work remotely in Brainerd, but may have to find their way to the headquarters once in a while. And so travel out of some of these mid or small markets, the demand seems to be going up as the type of work or the geography of the work is changing among the workforce. And so the Delta marketing and network planning team, staying very focused on where the consumer is, what kind of service, frequency, gauge do they need, and then responding to that, because it's not the same travel patterns necessarily as we have seen in the past.
That's amazing. I mean, I hadn't thought of that you suddenly these smaller hub cities become more important as people move to the exurbs or move into more remote rural areas and can continue to work from there. That's absolutely fascinating.
Yep.
I just want to sort of ask you a little bit about, other leadership lessons that you may have learned over the course of a career, and particularly as we try and train our next generation of business leaders, our students, how have you felt? I mean, you've been one of the rare people who's stayed in, pretty much one organization. I mean, yes, there was Northwest and Delta, but for most of your career. But you've also had this amazing range of experiences, from engineering and all the way to sort of finance and operations. I mean, it's been quite a range. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned from the kind of career you've had, and what lessons might there be for our students as they go into the future?
Well, one thing that I've learned quite a bit. I walked you through a little bit of my lineage as I went through Northwest and Delta.
Right.
Along the way, I worked for many great leaders. Ed Bastian, Richard Anderson, I can go down the list. But I also worked for a couple of really bad leaders. Not many, but a couple of really bad. But one thing is true. I learned from all of them. And back early in my career in the early 90s, when I was an engineer working on structures for Northwest, and I was sitting in my office at the airport in Minneapolis wondering, is this what I want to do my entire career? As the Gulf War was kicking in and airlines were a bit risky at the time because fuel was going way up. Should I diversify myself? That's when I went back to get my MBA. And then I was able to take my career in a lot of different directions. So work for a lot of people along the way. So I decided, let me back up. I decided that was when, rather than being an individual contributor, I think I'm cut out for being a leader. I enjoy it. I want to learn more about it. I was being a student of it, whether it was at school or at work. And so what I did starting in the mid-90s is I started jotting down on a piece of paper all of the leadership attributes, the leadership behaviors, characteristics that I saw leaders exhibiting that would motivate either me or a team to perform and deliver results. And so over the course of many, many years, I was jotting these things down and I came up with this list. It's a one-pager. And I think you're going to provide it to your viewers at some point, Sri, but I sent it in as a quick handout if anyone wants to take a look at it. I jotted down my ideas, my thoughts about leadership. None of these are my invention. It was really just me observing, what do effective leaders do? And in some cases, what do poor leaders do that I should avoid? Or maybe what's the antithesis of that, and put that down on this piece of paper. So I made up this leadership thoughts document. I was updating it about every 6, 12 months or sooner if something hit me very quickly. And I use that as a reference. It's not a completely comprehensive list of my leadership thoughts, but those that are most meaningful to me. And some of these are not innate for me. For some of these, I need to be conditioned. So what I did is I put this document in the right-hand drawer of any desk that I sat at. And occasionally I'd pull it out and I would take a look at it. And I would reference what it was that I knew was effective, I believed was effective as a leadership trait or quality or behavior. And then I would remind myself, you've got to do this, Bill. Like, you've got to recognize your people. Because sometimes when you get in the middle of a pretty dynamic, heated situation, stressful period of time, you sometimes forget that your people are what are making this happen. It's not necessarily you. And you've got to recognize them for that. The investment the return on that investment is incredible. And others were somewhat innate. So that leadership thoughts document that I put together, I would fall back on that on a pretty regular basis. On top of it, there are two things that I call my absolutes. And quite frankly, they don't really have anything to do with leadership. It's just, for me, what is work all about? Family comes first, is absolutely the most important for me. And second, I have to have fun. If I'm not having fun doing what I'm doing, it's going to be a long day, long week, long month, a long career. I've got to have fun. Those are the only two that are particularly in order. The rest of these things just are kind of in no particular rank order, or they're just chronologically how they came to my mind. But I've learned a lot from the different leaders I've worked for, who I've seen in action. Maybe I didn't necessarily work directly for them, but I wanted to become and force myself to become a student of leadership and pay attention to it. So I would just suggest sharing that with your viewers. Some of that might strike them, some of that might not strike them, but it's my collection of the things that I've learned over the years. In fact, it was about 25 years worth of learnings boiled down to one page of what I thought was really important. And many of them I had to rely on. Things like, people would rather follow a leader who's real versus one who's always real versus one who's always right. That vulnerability, that authenticity as a leader. Don't feel like you need to know it all. The last year and a half, if it taught me one thing, it was that I don't know a whole lot about a lot of situations, but I can learn quickly if I make myself vulnerable and open up to those who understand better. And leaders have the courage to do that. A lot of people think that vulnerability as a leadership trait is a weakness. I think it's the truest determinator of an authentic, strong leader, is one who is vulnerable, willing to admit it, and is courageous enough to bring in the right thinking and follow someone else's suggestions rather than their own.
These are great learnings, Bill. I mean, clearly you've been a lifelong learner, and so many of these ideas that you've shared with us, recognition and listening and being vulnerable. I mean, these are, truly, great lessons for anyone who is aspires to, business leadership or leadership in any kind of frame, as it were. And that probably brings me to my last question, because I know the audience will have questions for you as well. I know you're making this big transition from running a, major non-profit airline to becoming the chief operating officer for the Catholic Archdiocese, and that's a very major change in what you will be managing and how you're going about it. So, what drove that decision? What's next for you? What's on your mind as you make this transition, and how do you plan to approach it?
Well, I didn't make the decision to retire from Delta so that I could go to this job at the Archdiocese. In fact, I made my decision before I knew the job was there. I made the decision to retire because I wanted to spend more time with my family. I'd had 32 years in the airline industry, a lot of ups and downs. I would never trade it. Met great people. I've had a lot of fun. I've seen the world. So it's been very good to me and my family, but I spent a lot of time away from my family. And I now have 2 grandchildren, and and they're all in the Twin Cities. So being away from the family as it grows, both in age and in size, it was something that concerned me. I wanted to spend more time with my wife, wanted to work more on the marriage with my wife. And so it was really all about family. There was nothing else that factored into my decision. And then, right on the heels of that, because I've been on the board of the seminaries of both St. Paul Seminary and the St. John Vianney Seminary over at the University of St. Thomas, I've become familiar with the Archbishop. There's a need in the Catholic Church for some deeper business acumen, someone who's been through the execution of a strategic plan, et cetera, and coming out of bankruptcy and some of the priest abuse that they experienced in the past, ready to move on to the next level and really bring the church closer together. And for a community like the Catholic Church that has been so good to my family, I really want to help. And so that's the whole purpose behind this, is taking the learnings that I had in my for-profit world into the Catholic Church and work alongside the Archbishop and the priests, the parishes, the schools, and do what I can to assist there. And going into it, for me, the transition, I've already shared this with the staff there, is I need to be a listener. While I understand the Catholic faith, I don't understand the Archdiocese all that well. I think I know what I'm getting myself into, but for the first 60, 90 days, it's going to be absorb. It's going to be inform. It's going to be learn, listen, learn. It's not going to be a whole lot of decision making. And that's one of the suggestions that I give to any leader when you move into a new organization. This is part of the be vulnerable, be real, is take time to really listen. Really understand what's on the minds of those who are in the organization, those who are affected by the organization, before you make too many decisions about where you want to take the organization. That's the mode I'm going to be in for a period of time, is just really listening and absorbing, and then forming the plan.
Great lessons, Bill. I know there are lots of questions in the audience. So Amy, will you take it away?
Of course. Yes, Bill, we have a lot of questions to get to. The first one talks about Delta was positively highlighted in a recent HBR article about change management. What would you say is your biggest lesson that others could learn from about leading in change?
I didn't have a chance to read the article, but I, of course, experienced a lot of the change management that went on there. I really believe it is about listening to those who are going to be affected by the change and making sure that they are involved. They have buy-in, they are aligned, they stay informed about where you are headed. People need to know where you are going and understand why you are going there before they're going to put the full thrust behind it. In fact, I've got my leadership lesson, my leadership thoughts here. Let me see if I can find exactly how I state this on here. Yeah, you must be a communicator. Does your team know where you're leading them and why? And you need to support decisions, even though you may not completely agree with them. You need all oars in the water, and you need to have everyone in line with you. The team, if you're a man short, the team doesn't perform as well as when everyone is on, understands the mission, and they're going in the same direction. So it really is about engaging, listening, formulating a plan with involvement from those who are ultimately having to execute it, and then making sure that you communicate status, where we're going, and if there's adjustments that need to be made along the way, keeping them involved. They just want to feel valued, like they're part of the change, not just having change directed at them.
Right. We know a lot about rowing the boat over here at the University of Minnesota. As
yes,
you know.
we do. So, I thought I'd throw that in there.
That sounded familiar. We have a question from Troy, who was a Carlson grad of 92 and a Northwest employee from 99 to 2002. And his question is, the traditional supply push airline business model seems broken, with a complete shutdown that wipes out jobs and all shareholder value every 10 years. I don't see any fundamental shifts in this older, seemingly broken business model. What's new with new air transportation business models? And he also wants to say that he loves the red tail bird above your head.
Oh, there is one up there. Yeah, I've got a mix here of red and blue tails here. So what is fundamentally broken about the business model? I would push back a little bit on that, Troy, and share that I think a lot has changed about the way the business is operated and some of the financial decisions that are made. Candidly, if you would have put COVID in the middle of whether it was Northwest or Delta Airlines 15 years ago, there wouldn't be a Northwest or a Delta Airlines right now. To be able to survive this pandemic the way the airline has, and quite frankly, return to positive cash flow as quickly as it has, I think something has changed, but there still needs to be some change, don't get me wrong. But it is better understanding the customer. It is the alliances that we have with partners around the world. So rather than thinking Delta has to do all the flying, partnerships that we have where we fly someone else's customers here in the US and they fly our customers somewhere in Europe or in Asia, really important, building those global alliances. So the strength of the global alliances, understanding the customer need, rolling out digital technology to provide a better experience. And then, when in periods where the airline is profitable, being really wise about how you invest those profits, making sure and Delta had a very disciplined, capital allocation, and it was some was to the shareholders, some was to the employees, some was to pay down debt. It was a very structured formula, and it was one that we stayed committed to and executed on. So I take the feedback, very openly and candidly, that we are, here we are in another crisis, but the world's in a crisis, but this is a crisis that would have knocked many airlines out of business. And if you look across the industry, there are still quite a few. And I know that there has been some government support to assist here, but the model is much more resilient, much more durable than it was 10 or 15 years ago through all of the things that I had just indicated, and managing the costs much more effectively than we did 10, 15 years ago.
Bill, to also kind of piggyback on that, one of our participants is asking about how significant was the federal support to your survival? Since you just mentioned that, you might want to. Yeah,
I mean, what would have happened had we not had federal support? I think certainly a different outcome, and I'm probably, I would say I'm not qualified to make any predictions there. Was it meaningful, the first round of support? It was, because we saw revenue, as I indicated, decline 95%. You can't bring costs down that quickly. But successive rounds of the government support, there's debate about whether or not that was completely necessary. It's hard to say. But when others are receiving the support, you handcuff yourself when you don't. And so we made our decision that we were going to take, and I think Ed was very clear about this many months ago, that not really sure that we need round three, but we can't handicap ourselves against others. And so we need to keep the playing field level. And frankly, I would tell you, that those for Delta, those rounds of government support and the decisions that Delta made allowed Delta to not lay off not furlough a single employee throughout this entire event. So if you want to use that as a measure of success, I would say it was very successful in the eyes of Delta. Combination of the way we managed our costs with support from the government and what our people did to step up to the plate and support one another, we preserved every job that we had on the plate. I mean, we had some who voluntarily left, but anyone who wanted to have a job at Delta still does today. And if that's the measure of success, I say it was very successful.
Great, thank you. Brian is letting us know that he was on your last DL flight as an employee from Atlanta to Minneapolis. And he says, you have become the face of Delta Airline last year, even surpassing the CEO in the in-flight video. What effect did that have on you personally, meaning the stress of keeping a major company together?
Well, I would be lying if I said anything other than the last year and a half was the most difficult of my life. Certainly of my professional career, and I would say of my life. It was having to be on your game all the time, 24/7. You just never knew when something was going to hit. Ed did a lot of media engagement. I was asked to do a fair amount of media engagement as well, making sure that his message and my message stayed in sync, even though we were both going 100 miles an hour. That gets mentally fatiguing. And so through all of that, what I learned is sleep is important. Getting a mental break from this kind of stuff is important. Making sure your eating rate is important. I know I'm sounding like my mother, but it is true. These things are, during those moments, that stuff is really important. And finding, just being confident enough in your team that you can break away, go get some rest, get something to eat, get your mind off it is really important so that you can keep yourself refreshed. I am thoroughly impressed by the way Ed is able to keep himself on the game day in and day out. Because if I thought I had people looking at what I was doing or what I was saying, he's got it 10x because of the role that he has and ultimately the gravity of his decisions. And he was the guy who was owning up to the decisions. I'm amazed at the way he's able to take care of that. And I think a lot of it is just kind of balancing the stresses with some things that you enjoy in your life and getting yourself away from it for a little bit. Really important. So it wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. When I was sitting on an airplane flying to Atlanta and that video would come on, I'd have people looking at the video and then looking over at me and then looking at the video again. And I thought, okay, we're going to want to engage in some conversation here. That's not easy either, because that was a time for me to either do some work or to just kind of tune it out and listen to some music and recharge the battery a little bit. So when I finally started wearing a mask and got some cheater glasses and I put those on, I didn't look like that guy on the screen anymore. And I found myself a little more free time to just disconnect a little bit and get some juice back in the battery. It's really important during those moments of stress, particularly when they're prolonged like this one has been.
That's good advice for all of us. We're getting a question about innovation. So some would say that it would be a shame to waste the innovation made over the pandemic. Which changes brought on by the pandemic do you see sticking into the future?
Well, I think, the quick move to digital technology and tools that will allow greater self-service, clearly, we were going that path anyway, but the acceleration of that, absolutely the case. The cleaning, some of the innovation that we have done around cleaning is here to stay, no doubt about that. And I wouldn't necessarily call this innovation, but one of the things that, and this is, back to, don't mortgage the future. One of the things that we stayed true to through this entire period was we were going to stay on course with all of the capital investments in our airports. So at pre-pandemic, at various stages, there was a total of about $12 billion of capital investment in airport facilities underway in the United States. Throughout the pandemic, that number never dropped. And in fact, I would tell you, that much of that development that we were undergoing at airports was accelerated. While there were no people in the airports, let's accelerate some of the renovations that we were doing. So whether it was T3 in the head house out in LA, it was the lobby work that's going on here in Minneapolis, LaGuardia Airport's getting a complete new terminal. I mean, these are all investments that we are part of. There was an acceleration of that. So all of that, along with the technology that we are wrapping in, clearly very permanent. And I think, this whole mass personalization concept is something that you're going to see more and more of out of certainly Delta, and I think the other airlines, is finding a way to really uniquely connect to the individual needs of the consumer, rather than building a product that you think is going to satisfy all of them. Just not the case. And so I think more tools to allow individualized experiences, whether it's in the airport, well, if you're booking a flight in the airport, on board the airplane, or with any of the partners, I think you'll see continued push down that path.
All right, we have time for one more question, and this is a couple of people asking the same question about how do you capture and prioritize inputs and concerns from customers?
Well, we do it several ways. As far as the capturing goes, you probably, if you've flown Delta Airlines, you've received an email asking you to fill out a survey. Delta has in a typical year 200 million customers, and we will get 40 million responses back. It's a pretty significant, anywhere from 17 to 20% of our customers at any given time are feeding back to us about their experience, whether it was an experience that had no issues and we just want to know, how did things go on a Bluebird day, or if there were issues, we'd send out a slightly different survey because we knew that we had mishandled their bag, or maybe they had a misconnection, didn't get their connection, or had experienced a cancellation, whatever it might be. So we collect all of that data, and we have a large group of customer insights analysts who will process that data and make good information out of it. That's just one way. We monitor social media to get a sense for it. We use focus groups. We spend a lot of time in front of our corporate customers. During the pandemic, every week, I was connecting with our sales group, and we would get in front of the Medtronics, the 3Ms, the Cargills of the world, and all of their travel managers and their senior leadership to understand where they were at and what it was that we needed to do to satisfy. This whole middle seat block that we had, Delta was the only airline that went into 2021 with a middle seat block. We didn't do that for scientific reasons, candidly. We did that, while the science was saying space is important and it helps, we did that because the customer was telling us they wanted more space. That was where people came before profits. We were listening through multiple channels. And then, as I indicated, the consumer insights team would take all of that data and they would process information. And then we'd get together as a leadership team and talk through feedback, trends, opportunities. Where do we need to make investments? Where do we need to adjust the product? And that was a weekly process that we had. Tuesdays, we were looking at the customer feedback. Thursdays, we were having conversations about what do we need to do with it. And then Tuesday, we'd look at the feedback again, on and on and on. So, and that was outside of my daily meetings. So a lot of channels for feedback from the consumer.
Thank you, Bill. This was extremely insightful. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I particularly appreciated some of the things you said about, the leaders in the past year and a half having to be always on. And I'm reminded of the famous line from every flight I've ever taken, which is, put on your oxygen mask before you help others. So I think the role of leaders and try sort of things.
Absolutely. That's a really perfect. Absolutely. Take care of others.
That's
and
right.
Take care of yourself.
That's right. That's right. So thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your ideas. And of course, thank you to our audience for joining us. And we hope you'll be able to join us next month for another exciting First Tuesday. Our featured speakers for next month are the head coaches of the University of Minnesota's women's and men's basketball teams. and Ben Johnson, not the baseball team, but the basketball teams. They'll be joined by our guest moderator and former UMN women's basketball player, Leah B. Olson. So please be on the lookout for an email with details about next month's event, and make sure to check our website for any updates. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Bill, for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.